Today on What the Heck is Happening in HR, it's one of our favorite topics, Fair Labor Standards Act, because a whole lot has changed. For our podcast disclaimer, please visit the episode description. Thanks for coming back to What the Heck is Happening in HR. Today, we're going to talk about that Fair Labor Standards Act because people are wondering what happened. So back in November 15th, actually, on 2024, a federal judge in the Eastern District of Texas struck down the Biden administration's Fair Labor Standards Act overtime final rule. The decision eliminates the scheduled salary threshold increase previously set to take effect January 1st, as well as the automatic updates that were going to happen every 3 years after that. All right, let's talk about this a little bit. At one point, the exemption salary threshold was $455. Now remember, and my students, I'm sure, are all going to say this with me, for most of the exempt positions, there are other things like outside sales and highly but we're going to talk about for the majority of exempt positions, there are 3 things needed. 1, they must be paid a weekly salary. That weekly salary, too, must be at least a certain threshold. At one point, it was $455. And they must pass a duties test. It's not an or, it's an and. All 3 items must be matched. And that duties test means that they pass the regulations, if you will, or the information that's provided by the Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Division, that says this is an exempt position, such as they may be of a learned profession. They may be a CPA, and that generally will mean it's an exempt position. They may have hiring and firing authority over a certain number of employees. That could lend itself to be an exempt position. But one of those items is that weekly salary, no matter how many hours they work, and it needs to be at a certain level. And that's what we're talking about. That's what was struck down because in January, this amount was to go to $1,128 per week. Now, that exemption annually would have been about $58,656. And that was to take place January 1st, 2025. Now, remember, I said that this law changed because of the Eastern District of Texas judge, a federal judge, said, nope, that's not going to happen. It's too far a reach. If you need information on that, go back and listen to the podcast on the Chevron deference. But it was too big a reach for businesses to do that. And so he said, ain't going to happen. And in fact, he said it shouldn't have happened in July. Now remember, this is November 15th. Those pay changes already went into effect because it went from $455 years ago. Before July 1st, 2024, that salary threshold was $684. July 1st, 2024, the Biden administration's final rule took it to $844. So if you had exempt employees, their duties test was an exemption, and they were making, let's just say, $700 a week. They were fine before July 1st, but after July 1st, 2024, you probably raised their salary to at least $844 in order for that exemption to continue. And remember, an exemption means that they are exempt from being paid minimum wage, and they are exempt from being paid overtime. So they can work 100 hours for that salary, and it can take their minimum wage for themselves down to $1.50, and it doesn't matter. They're exempt from that law. And then being exempt from overtime, being paid time and a half for any hours over 40 in the same work week. So we went from $684 before July 1st to $844 after July 1st. And then January 1st, 2025, it was supposed to be $1,128. So I want to tell you about something that was like all over the web. and specifically LinkedIn, and it focuses on Ohio University. They had an implementation they communicated in 2 phases. The first one said that they were going to adjust employees for that July 1st move to 844, and they did that. And they announced to everyone that they plan to move to the January 1st, 2025 change. Well, after this ruling came out, and after Ohio University had announced that these employees were getting an additional pay raise, they said, no, we're not going to do that January 1st, 2025 pay raise. Instead, we will keep the July 1st, 2024 pay raise, but we will not be moving ahead with phase 2, that January 1st change. And people were really in an uproar. And there was some misinformation out there. Can you imagine misinformation on the web? But there was misinformation that they were totally rolled back because the federal judge did say, hey, we're not doing 1128. And by the way, we're not doing 844. You can go back to 684. But Ohio University did not do that. They had moved just as many employers had done because it was well past July. But they did stop the January 1st federal requirement to move that salary threshold. So I bring that up because, one, I wanted to get the information out there, which I took off the Ohio University memorandums. So yes, I read everything, but I don't believe it all until I go to the sources. So they didn't carve out, the raises. Yes, they told people they were getting increases that they're not getting, but they told them the why. And if you will, they're faulted a bit for being transparent because they needed to be able to say and let their employees know that a federal court could stop this because it did stop. This is the same federal court that stopped Obama's administration from putting in their final regulation, which was taking it to over $900. So this is not a surprise. We knew it was sitting there in the cases. We knew that a federal judge was going to rule on it. So instead of making the promise, which they broke, they really needed to let them know that it's a maybe. And that's where I fault them. I haven't seen anything that said it might not happen. And so they broke a promise, and so they broke the trust. And we've had so many things happen from COVID when we were told we couldn't work at home to, go home and work, to pay changes like this. They just end up being broken trust. And it's hard to recover. Steve Covey wrote that great book, Moving at the Speed of Trust, that organizations can perform at the speed of trust and only at the speed of trust. I go through this exercise. One is to let you know what happened with the federal judge and that it really did roll back to 684. But two, to really give the employees, when you communicate that with them, the full story, that it might not happen, because we are waiting to hear from a federal judge. And if you're in HR, you need to be sure your workforce and your leadership understands that. And it isn't about putting your head in the sand and just saying, okay, let's go, because everyone's going to get increases. They added up a lot, and it isn't happening. So I want to just be sure that you're always up to date with what's happening. Don't just believe everything you read. Go back to sources, understand what it means. And one of the best ways to do that is to subscribe to this little micro podcast, What the Heck is Happening in HR? We're on every platform that you subscribe to. So please be sure to give us some feedback and let us know what else you want to hear on What the Heck is Happening in HR.